Let's begin with a silent meditation. So we've seen that one of the most important contexts for understanding the meaning of the path of transformation, the way of Tantra, is the three views that I often refer to as the traditional, the tantric, and the mystical or transcendent or non-dual. The latter really can be experienced in different ways. So to be more general, perhaps we could use a term like the transcendent view. Even though that's not exactly a perfect word for it, because although in many traditions the non-dual is the sort of essential transcendent or mystical experience, there are variations on that. Very different traditions and different individuals sort of have a, their own sensibility about the nature of the transcendent. So to be more general, any of those could fit into that third view. And so these three views kind of create a context for understanding what the nature of the tantric perspective is, the tantric experience, the tantric intuition or sensibility, which is both a style of practice and also a way of experiencing reality. It's most deeply an intuition about experience, about the nature of reality, and about, especially about the process of transformation and awakening and spiritual evolution. The evolution of life in the universe can be experienced in a fundamentally tantric way. So these three views really are not equally well represented in all spiritual practices, or certainly not all paths or spiritual traditions or religions or philosophies. So one way of understanding a particular practice, for instance, or a whole tradition, is to develop a feel for and a clarity about the nature of these three approaches and the different forms they can take. They don't always take the same form, as I was just saying, for instance, about the transcendent view. For some, it might be experiencing a sense of a divine intelligence, a creator within all life, and from which all was intentionally manifested, and to experience a deep communion, a theosis, an experience of God consciousness, of that style. Whereas for somebody else, it might be more deeply connected to nature, a kind of nature mysticism, an interconnectedness of all life. And yet in another tradition, it might be a more radical experience of the Maya, the sort of temporary and impermanent and elusive quality of all phenomena, and how it ultimately all arises from a mysterious transcendental reality, Brahman, or Sunyata, the transcendent, indescribable, unknowable, nirguna, without the ability to be conceptualized in any way or qualified. So these are different styles to that view. In the same way, we can understand variations or versions of that from the transcendent point of view. There are different styles of Tantra as well. People have different philosophies about them. People apply the principle in different ways. And most importantly, what we find is that even in those traditions that view themselves as tantric, or whether they use that name or not, of course, the degree to which the spirit of Tantra is really understood in that tradition and integrated throughout the tradition varies a lot. So there are traditions that are explicitly Tantra, and they're terminology, and then there's pockets of their own style of practice or point of view that actually aren't particularly tantric. It hasn't really been integrated into that dimension. So when each of these views is present, for instance, in a tradition, they tend to deeply influence each other, so that even if you're working with a practice that's more sort of traditional in its foundation, it'll be changed and illuminated by the presence of these other views and the forms that they take. So when a particular tradition has a strong tantric dimension to it, and that's broadly integrated into that tradition, it informs and changes and kind of rebirths the style and way that even the tantric dimension or the traditional dimensions are practiced. So it's a very rich reality, understanding these three views, and volumes and volumes could be written, if we're just trying to put, not to mention the depth of what it means to intuitively realize these meanings, these principles, and integrate them into one's own life and see them in the world around us. So, as an example of what I mean, we can take a particular tradition, such as Theravada Buddhism, which is closest to the original teachings that the Buddha gave out. It's evolved somewhat over the millennia. A lot of subtle enrichment has happened, but basically it's rooted very strongly in Buddha's original teachings. And the way it's come down in modern times is that Theravada Buddhism has a very strong foundation on the traditional view. It tends to be a fairly mature version of that, in the sense that it's not a sort of heavy-handed, judgmental kind of black and white, good and bad type of. It's based more on the karmic principle of that our, for instance, our choices and our ethics should be based in just sort of understanding the mechanics of life, that there's karmic consequences to what we think and what we do. So there's a fairly strong spirit of acceptance and equanimity in that tradition. And so when, for instance, one engages in a profound practice like Vipassana, the foundational teachings of Vipassana are very traditional in the sense that you're taught that, for instance, the 7 factors of enlightenment. That's the sort of the positive side of the traditional view. And you're taught about the hindrances, the challenges, the unwholesome traits that are going to be those that lead to suffering and conflict and disease. And you're taught to sort of discriminate between them and to develop a deeper karmic appreciation of the implications of these two ways of being, a more spiritual quality, virtue-based way to be, way to feel, to understand, to act, versus. And so wisdom into these deepens as one does a standard Theravada Buddhist practice. And as one goes deeper into a Vipassana practice, one of the things that arises intuitively through just deeply contemplating reality as it is in our day-to-day experience, our emotions and our sensations, just the details of our lives, is a fundamental intuition starts to arise, called the 3 characteristics in Buddhism. And these are the reality that there's no inherent self in all this phenomena. If we look very closely at it, there's no stable, permanent self there. It's just kind of a karmic process of things going on. And that it's all in a flux, it's all impermanent. And so subsequently, if you try to seek fulfillment through this flux of life phenomena, events happening, bodies coming and going out of your life, conversations and states of mind, thoughts and emotions. Since it's all impermanent, you're really kind of setting yourself up for suffering if you get attached to it, because it will pass. Nothing's permanent in that flow of mind-body phenomena that we experience as human life and the world around us. So as one does Vipassana, a deep insight into impermanence and no self, and also dukkha, which is a Sanskrit word that means a kind of dissatisfaction. Like you don't have to tell yourself philosophically, oh, don't get attached to all this stuff, you know, it'll disappoint you. You just see very clearly by contemplation, you just deeply appreciate the reality that even in this very moment, everything is arising and dissolving away as phenomena in your experience. You know, even modern physics tells us, you know, the energies that make up our body are constantly changing. And biology tells us that the cells of our bodies are morphing over the years and coming and going. And in this state of deep intuitive contemplation, you witness that reality extremely clearly. And that leads to a sense of dukkha, or like a feeling like, well, why should I invest in my happiness in something that's so unpredictable and changeable and unreliable? So a sense that that deep down, if you really understand samsara, if you really understand the mind-body dimensions of reality, it's a dangerous place to invest in, because you will get burned eventually. You could have some temporary form of happiness for a period of time. So again, that type of insight still falls into the traditional category of a clear distinction between samsara and nirvana, between true happiness, truth, reality, and misunderstanding and dualism and unwholesome states and so on. But as one goes deeper into the practice, eventually a moment of ripeness will arrive. One will have an extraordinary awakening into the true nature of reality, into the reality of Buddha nature, and experience nirvana as the realization that that's actually the deeper truth of how things are. And that's the mystical perception, and that deepens over time to become a steady state of awareness. So what we see in Theravada Buddhism is a strong, classic, traditional, a particular version of it. There's various versions of the traditional mode, but a particular version of it, and then a strong mystical aspect that's developed, and a particular version of that as well. And not so much tantric perception. That's not very strongly developed. There's seeds of it. The more we understand the tantric view, the more we can kind of see where it's sort of growing somewhere. Maybe it hasn't blossomed into the tantric view yet. So for instance, when the Buddha realized the truth of the middle path, this is a doorway into the tantric view, seeding that within Buddhism and his own practice of bodhisattvahood, kind of set the tone for what later not only grew into Mahayana Buddhism, was centered more in the path of compassion and service, but also morphed into Vajrayana Buddhism, which is Tantric Buddhism. All that came out of Buddha's original impulse as well. And many people actually suggest esoterica, like for instance in Theosophical teachings, those masters, as well as the Vajrayana masters in Tibet and elsewhere, claim that Buddha actually taught all three of these views at that time. But that since in certain ways the tantric view is the most esoteric of them, he didn't teach that as openly. He taught it to an inner group of students that then transmitted that secretly within India, and later it moved to Tibet and it kind of blossomed into Vajrayana Buddhism. So it's claimed that even that was not even just seeded then, it was explicitly expressed by the Buddha in that time. So, but in the current version of standard Theravada Buddhism that's taught in the world today, it's generally a strong and deep foundation in traditional spirituality and a deep mysticism, not as much emphasis on the tantric view. There are modern Western teachers like Jack Kornfield who are introducing that element into it more, but it's not traditional. Another example of a way, a kind of combination, is the Sant Mat tradition that I referred to, that I talked about, have been initiated into myself. Again, strong foundation in traditional teachings, and then a mystical component, and not so well developed in the tantric area. And then their version of mysticism is kind of more a version of a creator deity type of bhakti style mysticism, with some non-dual overtones, but they're not as well integrated. It's sort of in the deepest aspects of it, and it's not that well integrated with the rest of their style and tradition, their understanding. Another example that's sort of similar to that is Advaita Vedanta, as taught by folks like Gaudapada and Shankara, Ramana Maharshi. In the case of Shankara, again, strong traditional foundation and a very strong emphasis on the non-dual version of the mystical or transcendent point of view, and not as much Tantra. So as it's come down into modern times, that's the sort of basic spirit of Advaita. And folks like Ramana Maharshi definitely spun it that way. In fact, Ramana didn't even really teach much on the traditional level. He just sort of heavily emphasized the non-dual aspect. Not much Tantra, not much of the traditional. Although apparently Ramana did have deep knowledge of these other views, and would kind of, generally kind of more abstractly make reference to them. In fact, there's a story, as I've said, a common and integral aspect in many traditions of this tantric view. It's not the only way to approach it, but is Kundalini Yoga. And there's a story about when Ramana was once received a student who asked him, as an advanced practitioner, and he asked him some questions about his personal practice, saying that he was doing Kundalini Yoga, working with specific kinds of practices, and the Kundalini had reached a certain point in his upper chakras and was kind of bogged down. There were some challenges there, and he asked Ramana how to work with this. Now, what of course people who know much about Ramana would imagine is that since he was so sort of centered in this non-dual approach, that he would have kind of dismissed that and just pointed at sort of self-inquiry. But instead he brought this individual into a private room and had a conversation with him. Now, a few of his longtime students were very curious. What's Ramana doing? Why is this a sort of private conversation? What are they talking about? So they snuck over to a window and listened to the conversation from that side. And it turns out Ramana knew all about Kundalini Yoga, about mantras and chakras, and he guided the person through like what he needed to do to shift this blockage and get the Kundalini through like the throat, head air, into the head chakras. And the person, was, so he just had all this understanding in him. He just wasn't expressing it as the primary focus of his teachings. So in a sense, that's there. And actually that kind of parallels Shankara's teachings, because although in the same way that Ramana is known more for his non-dualism, Shankara, of course, is particularly well known for his Advaita teachings. But it actually turns out that he was a master of Tantra as well, and wrote a famous book called The Wave of Bliss that's about Tantric and Kundalini Yoga as well. So that's in that tradition too. It's just not what as strongly emphasized, but some modern groups like Swami Rama's lineage do that trace their teachings in part back to Shankara. do emphasize a lot of that tantric element in their style. In a system like Theravada or Tibetan Buddhism, the tantric element is much more highly developed. So the very rich, sophisticated approach to the traditional foundational practices. Then there's a very rich, multifaceted tantric aspect to their teachings, and then of course a profound and multifaceted approach to the non-dual practices like Mahamudra and Dzogchen tend to emphasize the more radically non-dual approach. And then, say for instance, in a system like Nyingmapa Buddhism, the original teachings from that were rooted more in the original transmitters like Padmasambhava, there's a multi-stage approach to the tantric practices and different styles as well, like the 6 yogas of Meropa or various forms of deity yoga practices that are used to bring about the transformation. And in fact, so much is that tantric aspect emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism that it often simply goes by the name of Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism, meaning the diamond approach, this kind of special approach that's unusually profound and accelerated specifically because it's a tantric approach. So that would be an example of one in which the tantric aspect is very present. Then we could get into sort of subtler details as the deeper we kind of go into what does tantra mean, the more we can sort of look at a particular version of it and say, you know, how thorough an understanding of tantra is represented here, how rich a version of what it can mean to practice tantra, to understand tantra. You know, frankly, none of these traditions are doing it perfectly, and one of the easiest ways we can see that is obviously an inclusion of the feminine is a standard part of the tantric approach, but it's not uncommon in a lot of these traditions, East or West, to not have as favorable or positive inclusion of women in the practices. So that, for instance, when Tenzin Palmo, a British woman, went to India in the 60s and to train in Tibetan Buddhism, she said that it wasn't easy to find a teacher that would teach her. A lot of the Tibetan teachers wouldn't teach a woman. In fact, there's a teaching in Tibetan Buddhism. You know, not all the masters think this way, and some of the great masters certainly don't. But it's kind of common for there to even be teachings in a tradition like Tibetan Buddhism where you're taught to say a prayer if you're a woman, to pray for a rebirth as a man so that you can become more enlightened. It's better, you know, some Tibetans believe this. To me, that's a big shadow element where the tantric spirit, not to mention the non-dual spirit, hasn't been integrated into that part of and that's a big part of their spiritual practice. So that's a more kind of gross lack of integration. But there are subtler ones too, on a philosophical level and on the level of practice, where we could go to like a Qigong tradition or Taoist tradition or Hindu tantric tradition and say, well, at least, you know, from my point of view, from my understanding of tantra, oh, this one is pretty tantric, but it's still, let's say, elevates Shakti over Shiva, for instance. That's not an uncommon kind of leaning in some of the tantric traditions in India, is to view one of the two as sort of like the ultimate realization and the other sort of subordinate to that. Technically speaking, this is not a kind of radical appreciation of in my view, of the inner implications of Tantra, which is a profound interdependence between the masculine and the feminine principles, to such a degree that from a radically non-dual version of Tantra, it doesn't make sense to think of either one as preferable to sort of emphasize the style. Well, we kind of lean this way or lean that way. So that's my sentiment, is that a balanced marriage of Shiva and Shakti, divine masculine and feminine, is the preferred approach. And we see kind of, variations of how this isn't necessarily represented in all traditions. So that appreciation and discrimination about the nature of Tantra and what forms it takes and how well it's represented in a given tradition, that's a very rich kind of thing. It's my feeling that as these understandings develop in the centuries ahead, practitioners will become more sophisticated and deeply attuned and intuitively aware of these discriminations. And that'll be part of the transformation, kind of healing, because these do need to be healed. They're all subtle forms of gross or subtle forms of imbalance within our nature. If our own understanding of the path is out of balance, favors one side or another of these basic polarities, then that has implications. It affects our style. And there are kind of obvious versions of that, and then there are increasingly subtle versions of that. So take some time to kind of flush all that out. So as we go on in this webinar, we'll continue to identify these issues, these different aspects, and kind of bring them out into the light more. And I think for me, this is an ongoing thing. It's not a static, we're obviously deepening our understanding of the nature of the spiritual path, the nature of reality, the human nature, the nature of enlightenment. And I'm not a sort of traditionalist in the sense of just believing that the ancient ones figured this all out a long time ago, and we're just trying to kind of maintain those systems and embody them. My feeling is the lineages themselves are dynamic, they're alive, they're in a process of transformation and enlightenment themselves. And so all of this is open to reevaluation. All of it's transforming and illuminating as we go through time. And that, as I've suggested in the past, I feel like the time period we live in now is particularly alive with this kind of change. There's a shift happening. My feeling from what I can see is I suspect this shift is in virtually every tradition that exists in the world today. It's a transformation that's happening to all of the spiritual traditions. For instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, we see not only in modern Tibetan teachers, like the Dalai Lama, are kind of influenced by the times and are kind of bringing a subtly changed spirit into the way they're talking about Tibetan Buddhism. But a lot of the Western practitioners that are inheriting this tradition, which has a lot of depth and beauty to it, are starting to kind of spin it in their own ways and kind of bring a psychological flavor into it and find richer ways to express compassion, have it become more engaged. And that tantric spirit I mentioned and the sort of imbalance towards female practitioners is being addressed deeply, and we have a shift going on there. So there's a great, sort of a fourth turning of the wheel, they sometimes call it. Like Buddhism's gone through various transformations over the millennia, and many view kind of a new Buddhism emerging in the world today, especially through the transmission to the West. And this is just an ongoing evolution, ongoing refinement and illumination of the traditions themselves. So we talked a bit last time about the notion that there are basic psychological elements within each of us. The Tantra addresses two fundamental realities, our own internal state, and how we experience our own awakening, our own spiritual evolution. But also, there's a sort of external tantra. How do we experience the world around us as well? Our life, our relationships, nature, and so on. So in a sense, you could say there's an internal tantra and an external tantra. And this is important too from the angle that, incidentally, it's common for, as a lot of us know and have been exposed to, it's common for tantra to be associated with sexuality, because sexuality is such a powerful part of human nature. It's the energy of the propagation of the species, of the communion of energies. And so in a sense, how a particular spiritual teaching or individual relates to sexuality is kind of key in defining the nature of that path. And the tantric path has traditionally been an approach that has not been as squeamish about working directly with sexual energy, and not feeling like it's something that needs to be either sort of quietly ignored or purified, if not more actively condemned and repressed or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why Tantra has been embraced more readily also by householders, is that householders are already often engaged in a relationship and in procreation and in a sexual relationship with their partner. So Tantra is more compatible with that lifestyle, although it does, by its nature of being a spiritual path, seek to transform sexual energy. It's not just simply a sex is wonderful teaching. It's a teaching that sex can be included in the spiritual path as an integral part of a full life and a practice of awakening. But that's led many people to think, well, then it's kind of like, this is an oversimplification, of course. Is Tantra then kind of like the path of relationship and sacred sexuality? And it can include that, certainly, but it's really something broader and deeper than that. And one of the important distinctions to make is that in just in the same way I noted a moment ago that there's a kind of inner aspect to Tantra and an outer aspect. The choice, for instance, to be in a relationship as part of your spiritual path is, in a sense, part of the outer Tantra. But inner Tantra is independent from that. One can foster, for instance, a transformation of our own nature and a marriage of the internal masculine and feminine energies, regardless of what the context of our outer. We might be renunciate and do that. For instance, in traditions in the East, where Tantra is often practiced, like Tibetan Buddhism and Hindu Tantric schools and Taoist schools, some individuals in those traditions are actually renunciates, like Shankara was, and others are householders or engaged in some form of relationship. So either path, in fact, in some cases, there's even sort of a whole dialogue about, is one preferable to the other? And so, for instance, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the original founders of Tibetan Buddhism, like Padmasambhava, embraced embraced the householder lifestyle, embraced sexual practices as part of Tantra, and so on. And then in the 14th century, Tsongkhapa was viewed by the Gelugpa order, of which the Dalai Lama is a part. It came as a kind of reformer, and he said, well, it's fine to do these things, but the reality is that if we just completely relax the original precepts and engage in all kinds of any kind of activity and sort of view it all as included in the path, there's a much greater danger that people will fall off the path and even get involved in things like black magic. And so it's safer to be a renunciate. So we're going to kind of emphasize that. We're going to go back to saying outwardly we'll follow the traditional approach and we'll be renunciates predominantly. And inwardly we'll be tantric adepts and we'll foster this inner marriage as an internal practice and outwardly. So the Dalai Lama is a good example of that. He's a renunciate, but he's a tantric practitioner. So he works with this inner transformation and inner marriage, so to speak, but doesn't enact that in his life. He's not in a relationship. He doesn't engage in sexual practices and so on. So again, that's another example of how there are different philosophies, different approaches. What I think we're finding, though, around sexuality is it's such a powerful energy that even those that are renunciates, if they engage in teaching activities or they're sort of more engaged in life in general, they often have a hard time keeping their precepts to renounce sexuality. And they end up either just changing their mind and giving up their precepts, or they, in unfortunate cases, they just decide to kind of engage in relationships and sexual practices and just be hidden about it, claim that they're still renunciates, but secretly they're not. And this happens enough, actually, in all around the world, in all different kinds of traditions, that my feeling is people might as well just acknowledge that they're not done with this energy, instead of prematurely feeling like it's time to just let it go, and have a more tantric approach to it and just be in a mature relationship, make relationship a part of the path, work consciously with sexuality in this way, and just accept and embrace that as part of the path, rather than sort of having an ideal that it's best to be a renunciate. This is a sort of preferred approach, and that you're not as enlightened. Sometimes people feel if you're not a renunciate, and these kind of things. There's a sort of almost a kind of hierarchy that's set up where in some traditions where the renunciates are at the top of the hierarchy, and then you're considered not as advanced if you're a householder. We need to, I think, break that down because it's not really serving us. What I've noticed and other people as well is that a lot of these renunciates don't keep their vows anyway. So it's kind of, I don't think it's working. I think people need to be a little bit more careful about choosing that path. It certainly works well for some people, but it seems that it maybe works. There's an example is that right in Mount Shasta, where I lived for 20 years, there's an abbey there called Shasta Abbey. It's a thriving Zen center. It's founded by a British woman named J.U. Kennett, who went to Japan for years and studied Zen. She also studied Shingon Buddhism, which is a kind of Japanese version of Tantric Buddhism. So she kind of mixed that with the Zen. But in the early years, when she founded the Abbey, she allowed male and females to live there, and also to just freely relate to each other sexually. And she found it just kind of got out of control. There was just a lot of sleeping around and jealousy and stuff, and just kind of drama got escalated. And eventually she just said, okay, that's it. If you want to engage in sexual relationships, fine, but don't live here. You can live in the community and you can practice here, but everybody that's living here will be renunciates. That's how she kind of shut that down. And that seemed to work for years. And about maybe 10 years ago, it came out that after she passed and a new abbot took over, it came to light eventually that he was secretly engaged in a sexual relationship with one of the female practitioners there, and that there was a cover-up going on that other people knew about it and they weren't acknowledging it, and they were helping to sort of keep it quiet. So that erupted and it caused it. So again, we need to just find a more conscious way of working with this energy. It's a very powerful part of human experience. It's an important part of human experience because it's part of how we sustain the human kingdom. And the human kingdom is our path. It's not something unfortunate that's happened. It's something intentional. We want the human kingdom to exist. We're on the human path of spiritual awakening. So of course we need sexuality as the current method for creating bodies for people to be part of the human kingdom. So this isn't something that should be relegated to a secondary position in a kind of hierarchy of spiritual values where it's considered less if you're a householder or engaged in a relationship or procreating or engaged in sexuality. I think it needs to be consciously and deeply included in the path. But on the other hand, there's no reason, nothing about Tantra that says you need to be doing that. Tantra is a way of understanding the inner spirit. The deepest meaning of Tantra is it's an intuitive sensibility about life and about the path. And it has nothing to do with whether or not you're, say, politically active or not, or whether you're a renunciate or a lay person, whether you're engaged in sexuality or not. Tantra transcends these distinctions, and it's integrated or able to be practiced in any context like that. So it can be useful to deepening our sense of the meaning of Tantra to look at specific examples of what is being transformed on this path. And an interesting place to start is the very notion of self, the experience of being an individual, which is basic to our human experience. And when we look around us and even relate to, say, animals, even though perhaps animals don't have the same kind of sense of self, clearly they have some kind of a sense of self. Sense of self perhaps is universal, maybe in some form or another. It just permeates all of existence. That selfhood is individualization. It's in the essence of the way things come into being as distinct things. Although, of course, ultimately, in a sea of interdependence, individual selves really can't exist separately. In that, so selfhood doesn't mean in and of itself just separation. It means rather individuality within interrelationship. Now, very often in the traditional view, when we're sort of making categories of what's kind of helping us on the path, on the one hand, wholesome, positive, wise states of mind, cultivating qualities like contentment and compassion, and then problematic, challenging elements of experience, obstructions to enlightenment, obstructions to freedom and to peace, sources of suffering. And traditionally in those categories are attachments and judgments and all of the problematic motivations and emotions like ambition and aggression and jealousy and so on. Very often in many mystical traditions, another thing that's thrown into that category is the self. The self itself is considered a problem. The tantric perspective, though, I feel, can put that in another light in the same way that we can view, say, sexuality or anger or emotions, desires, as something that can be included and transformed into a spiritual version. Why not the self? Why, in the tantric view, perhaps the self also is not renounced or cast out. We don't have to say that the self is purely an illusion and has no reality. Maybe there's a transformed version of the self that can be included in our understanding of reality. So in sort of more radical versions of a sort of renunciate style path, it's common to follow a principle of, as they say in Sanskrit, neti, 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 which means not this. This isn't reality. This isn't true. This isn't valuable. So we just let it go, empty out, release all of the illusions, the obstructions, the hindrances, the imperfections. We just, not this. We purge until we discover a transcendental reality that's our true nature. So, even in Ramana's practice of self-inquiry, kind of the idea is, keep saying, who am I? And anything that arises, ordinary egoic sense of identity, desires, thoughts, traumas, and emotions and memories, you just kind of keep saying, who am I? Which is a way of saying, I don't buy this. I don't believe that that's truly who I am. So I will keep questioning, and all of this will kind of be purged from my nature, and eventually I'll discover that I'm Brahman, that I'm the absolute reality. And part of that is to sort of just, in a sense, renounce, to let go of, to purge all of these other levels of reality. The tantric view is more integrative. It's more transformative and inclusive, so that in a sense, it allows us to continue to be part of the relative level of existence, of life, ordinary human life, for instance, by learning to see the inherent divinity in everything that's ordinarily part of life. And that perception and experience transforms those elements without negating them, without tossing them out. So there's no need to say the self's an illusion. We can think of the self more as a mystery that's transforming in our experience. And as it transforms, it releases, becomes permeable to deeper realities, and becomes suffused with a sense of its interconnectedness with all of life, without disappearing. In fact, I would even argue that that's a more advanced understanding of the self, because it doesn't rely on a kind of duality of either affirming it or negating it. It's a subtler understanding of that reality. Nagarjuna understood this, I think, to some degree in his teachings, and as a great Mahayana Buddhist philosopher, when he kind of critiqued Buddha's original teachings of no self and said, well, technically that's an extreme view. That's making a statement about the nature of the self that's negative. And then in a sense, that's dualistic. We can't grab a hold of and affirm some rigid sense of self over here, but we can't negate it either. There's a middle path between these two that's subtler than that. Neither negating the ordinary self or affirming it. That's maybe a deeper truth. So this is one of the implications, I think one of the less commonly noted implications of the tantric perspective, that not only do we not necessarily follow a path of, say, completely kind of negating or releasing, not to mention repressing or condemning various aspects of our nature like desires. We don't need to do that to the self either. And certainly not to the body. One way to think about Tantra, the beauty of the Tantric vision, is that every element of human experience, each sense that we have, our desires, our aversions, our mind and our body as a whole, our emotions, our thoughts, our mind, our reasoning, each of these elements can be transformed into an illuminated version or counterpart. None of this needs to be eliminated or renounced or negated in any way. it can be transformed. Desire has an illumined version of itself. Anger has an illuminated version. The body as a whole has an illuminated version. The mind has an illuminated version. Intentionality has an illuminated. So one of the things that we notice in a lot of the spiritual teachings that currently exist in the world is a tendency to still feel, which is kind of more like a traditional approach, a need to negate things to describe enlightenment. Krishnamurti famously describes enlightenment as choiceless awareness. So if we kind of, from a non-dual tantric point of view, if we look a little more closely at what he was saying there, we notice two things. One is that it feels the need to throw out the will. It's not tantric in that it's not including the will. It's saying, okay, we're going to describe enlightenment as we need to get rid of choice, intentionality, that has to be jettisoned. It's not included or illuminated, it's renounced. And then what's left is awareness, which is a Shiva principle. So that's a style that favors Shiva and jettisoning the will. So it's not as balanced with the Shakti side, and it certainly doesn't engage intentionality. So this is part of what I mean by that. The more subtly we become attuned to the nature of this tantric vision, then we can see the implications of different formulations like that. A great, a story that is told by one of the Theravada Buddhist teachers is that there's a famous Asian Theravada teacher who one of his mantras was "No self, no problem." Meaning, if you just get rid of the experience of being a self, then you'll stop suffering and you'll stop having the experience of conflict. And in a certain sense, that's true. But as Nagarjuna pointed out, that's an extreme perspective. It's over on the side of negation, and negation can't possibly describe the enlightened state. The enlightened state's non-dual. It's not, conducive to being categorized as choiceless or silent or still or beyond sexuality or choiceless or no self, or all of these are negative descriptions of facets of our ordinary experience. And truly the non-dual transcends these types of negative descriptions. So the tantric vision is, in a sense, much more profoundly conducive to integrating enlightenment into ordinary life, because it doesn't take up this position of negation as a way of understanding what enlightenment looks like. It doesn't say no self. It doesn't say choiceless. It doesn't negate desire. But it does acknowledge the wisdom that all of these elements need to be transformed into in a sense, you could say, there's three realities. There is ordinary samsaric experience. There is the non-dual reality, which is not different from that. It's just a degree of recognition. And then there's an awakened state, an awakened version of all of the ordinary samsaric elements, where they continue to function and be experienced by human beings or other life forms, but in an awakened version. So you take the samsaric dimension and you transform it into the illumined version. Desire gets transformed. The body gets transformed. Aversions, emotions, the self, intentionality, the mind, all have an illuminated version in this awakened state. And that can be fully integrated into ordinary life, the awakened version. And it's easy to see in that context then how much more readily, from a tantric point of view, we can cultivate a kind of spirituality that appreciates life in the sense of looks at life as an opportunity for transformation. in fact, looks at even the raw material of life, ordinary day-to-day experiences, as the fuel of the fire of our awakening, not something that's unfortunate that's happening. Oh, I have this situation, and isn't that too bad? It's like stopping me from being able to do something else I want to do. It's an obstruction in my life. The tantric view is able to embrace that and say, what if this is actually just an integral part of my path? This is something that's not unfortunate that it's there. Only to the extent that if it's painful to me, it's kind of indicating to me there's wisdom to come here. There's transformation and healing that can happen. But instead of saying, oh, the real goal spiritually is to remove this obstacle so I can get on with what I'm really supposed to be doing, the obstacle becomes the path. Then I say, oh, loving this, healing this, transforming my relationship to this, that's what I'm called to do right now, rather than view this situation or this experience or this condition or what have you as something that's a hindrance, an obstacle, something to get rid of, something that's unfortunate. In a sense, then our whole life becomes the material of our awakening, and it's included and transformed in the spirit of that awakening. Okay, let's, I'm going to turn on the microphones and see if any comments or questions at this point. You know, I see a bunch of microphones still muted. I'm going to try a second time. Still muted. Oh, some came undone, some didn't. Raise your hand if you have a question, and then I'll specifically unmute your microphone because some are.
Yeah.
Is that Lena?
Yeah, I was kind of waiting if somebody else wanted to go first, okay. But if nobody else is, then.
Okay, thanks.
Huh? Okay, so. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks again.
You're welcome.
Inspiring. What would you say? What would be your opinion about the core essence of a tantra in relationships, in partnerships and maybe also in other relationships? Because what for me would be the key words would be openness and intimacy and acceptance and embracing and interdependence and yet independence and fully engaging and all these practices. But and I feel like one can practice this additionally to partnership, of course, as we practice it together with Hans Christian, but also in all kinds of other relationships where the other one is open for it. If the other one is understanding also, it's I would also feel like having a quite tantric relationship with my son, who is now 15, because he's very open to these things. But it would be interesting to hear from you also, and you also have a probably tantric relationship with Karen, your wife, and how about your own intimate relationships? I think it would be wonderful to hear some core essences from you, how you feel these things.
Kerne essenser. Core essence. Det bliver sådan dobbelt op, tænker jeg. Ja.
What was that, Lars? I couldn't hear what you were saying just then.
It was it was not supposed to be said anything.
Okay.
I forgot that I had the microphone.
I thought maybe you were just adding to that same question. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. It's a big question, of course, but I think the first thing that comes to my mind in response to that question is a very important part of relationship as a path of Tantra, not just a partnership with, say, a significant other, but like you were saying, with your son, any kind of relationship, is a full sense of a reciprocal relationship, like not only being an individual and standing in your own reality and speaking your truth, but being equally receptive. It's like a flow of energy between two people needs to be balanced, needs to be not only one in which you're projecting, but also receiving, that you're listening, that you're empathetic, that you're open to being influenced and transformed and challenged and stimulated and healed, and any of the fullness of what people can share with each other. There's a balanced flow in the relationship. Now, not every relationship is going to be balanced, but you still, in a deeply tantric perspective, there's always a way in which enrichment is happening both ways, if you're open to it. So I think that's a key part of what I would affirm as the spirit. And for some people, that's going to mean getting stronger in having faith in who they are and what they have to share in the relationship. Maybe they're more passive. Maybe they're less secure in themselves, and there's a need to get stronger in that way. And for other people, it might be more the opposite of a need to kind of become more receptive, become more attuned, look deeper into the reality of the relationship or the other person, and become open to that mystery. What can be, how can I grow from this? How can I learn? What am I not hearing? In what way am I not understanding this other person? Which is always, in a sense, until we achieve a radical level of enlightenment in which we're able to just completely mirror another human being, we're always missing something. There's always something deeper, some deeper understanding, deeper empathy that we can have. And so the living reality of that relationship is always stimulating, it's initiatory, it's transforming to be in a relationship of any sort. And not just to other human beings too, of course, other life forms, animals, plants, the earth, non-physical beings. The same principle applies in every direction to God. Even though I talk a lot about a more non-dual type of mysticism, my version of that also includes that there is a sort of primordial being that represents universal enlightenment. In Buddhism, it's sometimes called the Adi Buddha, the primordial Buddha, the Buddha that is eternal, that is the cosmic principle of love and wisdom, actively manifesting the universe eternally. And we can have a relationship to that intelligence as well, of which we're a part. This isn't some being that's... So in all directions, this relationship opens. And so that's a big part of what it means to me too. And in that context, all the other qualities that we talk about, being compassionate, being kind, but of course also there's a profound need for individuality. This is one of the reasons why I believe it's important. A very important part of the tantric vision to not kind of jettison, not cultivate a kind of spirituality that somehow negates individuality, because on the path of relationship, we don't want to cultivate an isolated or separative sense of self, but we do need an individualized sense of self, an ability to both feel a sense of interconnection in the context of feeling like a unique individual with our own sense of responsibility and our own sense of creativity and our own sense of potency. Every one of us is a doorway of the divine manifesting in the universe. We need to honor that power of directly actualizing enlightenment that each of us is. And in order to fully honor that, we have to individualize fully. We have to deepen our capacity to feel confident about ourselves, to trust in ourselves, to honor ourselves. But not in a way, let's say if we have a partner, for instance, not in a way that eclipses the other person. We don't push that individuality on the other person excessively, but we don't undervalue it either. So there's a great dance of working with those principles and developing those experiences and qualities within ourselves. So that's kind of what comes up. I don't know if if you want to follow up at all, Lena, to that question, comment, or
yeah, it's really beautiful answer. I also got like insights from it. But then, of course, you mentioned that amazing being Adi Buddha, and then of course there would be a follow-up question about if you could now or later or remember at some point describe like your own relationship to that being and what kind of a role that being plays in the Tantra as this transcendental being, maybe marrying Shiva and Shakti in a quite deep, profound ways. Like how can we, as a Tantrika practitioners, how can we then use that primordial archetype being for our practice? So I know it's also a little large question again, but
I'll make a note of that and include that soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any other questions or comments?
I have a comment. This is Tamara.
Hi, Tamara. Yes.
Hi. Sorry, I have my video screen off because I've been using my cell phone and just being able to walk around while I listen. So what comes to mind, I really appreciate your perspective and your teaching. I find it to be incredibly wholesome and healthy, and you know, I feel like this was something that I struggled with for years, and I just wanted to make a point from my own experience dealing with this sort of issue of the self. The teachings of no self, what I found that when I took those kinds of teachings on, that I actually turned it into an ego project of self-hatred, that it actually made me more and more unhappy and unhealthy, because I used it as sort of like, well, you know, like kill the self. Well, it's a bad, it's, you know, it became my own ego's project of self-hatred. And I recognized very sort of pretty soon that there wasn't a healthy approach for me, that I think so many Westerners, maybe like myself, will find that it becomes another ego project, and that actually sort of another approach altogether, which is what I sort of stumbled into, whether by chance or by luck or whatever, was this sort of receiving love practices, which are the healing to the self, and sort of melts it under the warmth of love, and has a sort of a transfer, you know, more of a tantric approach, and doesn't negate it. It works with it in a different way, but truthfully, any of those other practices I felt just became. I started to realize that the sense that we have of ego as self-aggrandizement isn't the typical. I mean, you know, some people have that, but most people have this sort of self-diminishment or you know, hatred of self is just as common an aspect of ego. It's a very painful aspect of ego. And so practices that sort of intensify that pain are clearly not liberating. I guess that's my point. And that's my personal experience with that kind of an approach or that kind of mentality. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, because it's very much to the point of, not just on a philosophical level, why I feel like it's maybe not the most enlightened view to emphasize a kind of no self or self-negating, but on a more psychological and healthy human level. I think it often has a kind of at least subtle, if not less than subtle, destructive or unhealthy impact. And so thank you for articulating that, because that's very much a part of my experience too, of observing how it affects people and myself. And so, yeah, thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see how we're doing for time. If there's any more questions, we have a moment before our break.
I have a question.
Yes, Lars.
And that if I can phrase it, the impression that I'm getting about the tantric approach is that it seems very much like what I see in the New Age movement in general, even though it's not specified or described very much like an in-between view, or so to speak, between one of the three views that you have talked about. Is my impression also your impression, or how would you phrase it regarding what we see in New Age or spiritual, modern or Western spiritual practice that is outside the traditional religions?
Well, yes, thank you for that question. Specifically, the New Age movement, which is, of course, is a kind of large, amorphous, multifaceted thing that, but I think we all more or less know what we mean by that, although it's kind of evolved over the years and has many different kind of dimensions to it. But generally, the New Age scene has been initially among other things, very influenced by Western esotericism, starting with like the theosophy and that kind of thing. But it also partakes in a lot of other influences, shamanism and modern psychology and the human potential movement and the classical traditions, Vedanta and Taoism and Sufism, and on and on. So it's a very rich, multifaceted thing. But one of the things that we very commonly see amongst New Age practitioners is a strong kind of appreciation for energy, working with vibrations, working with color and sound and visualization, and all of that is definitely very tantric, potentially, depending on truly how you understand it. But I think to some extent that tantric view really is behind that. And I'll be able to say more as we talk throughout the webinar and kind of go into different dimensions, especially what Shakti means and the Holy Spirit energy and nature and the intelligences behind nature. All of that kind of comes alive, comes to light more in a particularly important way in the tantric vision. And that's all very much alive in the New Age tradition or movement, if you will. The challenge there, though, when we move to the tantric vision, is that it's kind of like, you know, I've used a pyramid image before, where you kind of build a foundation, and you need to lay the foundation stones before you can put stones on top of them to build higher levels. So in our spiritual understanding and experience, we need a good foundation in order that the more advanced stages of our awakening are balanced and mature. If we have a kind of imperfect foundation, it's going to skew more advanced understandings. So part of the foundation, to look at it from the three views point of view, part of the foundation of our understanding of spirituality is the traditional view. We need to have real clarity about what that wisdom is about. And sometimes I think that that's not as well established in the New Age community. You know, this is a gross generalization, but so that would be a simple critique of Tantra in the New Age, is that sometimes the clarity of the foundation and the traditional wisdom is not as strong, and so the version of Tantra tends to be a little muddled often. And let me take one more step to clarify what I mean. Even though the tantric view embraces life, it does so with wisdom. It still has the wisdom of understanding that there are ways of being that lead to pain, to lead to conflict, and there's ways that are liberating. There are ways that are wholesome. There are ways that lead to a revelation of our true nature, that lead to truth and wholeness. And so we need to just sort of be very willing to face the facts, to be sober and just courageous in looking at the truth of what is really working in my life in terms of what leads to true happiness and wholeness and love, and what is the source of the problems. That clarity leads us to make a very well-established discrimination between things like, well, if I act out of anger with an intention to hurt another person, this is not just being tantric and it's crazy wisdom and everything goes if you're just sort of in the flow and you follow your feelings, and if that's my truth in the moment, then that's what I am, and just do it and it's fine. I think that's muddling these truths and mixing a kind of confused understanding of tantric and more non-dual truths in a way that where we've lost that foundation. We've lost an understanding of, and it really kind of lacks self-knowledge. So, we could go on. This is a big theme, actually, but hopefully that's enough to get I think there's enough is said, hopefully, to get some clarity about. It's very important to let's be realistic, folks. And the deepest version of this foundational wisdom is pretty harsh. Like, in the sense, from our human point of view, it's kind of, well, I see a lot of the way I ordinarily think and act is actually causing suffering to myself and other people. That's a sobering thing to realize, and it's a little bit hard on our self-image. That's why I think we need a big dose of patience and self-acceptance and compassion and understanding, because it's hard to see the truth, and we don't want it to just turn into self-negativity. It's important to be compassionate. So, but at the same time, we don't want to let that spirit of compassion and self-acceptance kind of soften us into a overly complacent kind of falling back into just being caught up in samsara and continuing to suffer. That's not loving either. That's letting ourselves just continue to be a source of suffering to ourselves and others, and not just kind of facing the facts of like. So in a loving and compassionate way, we need to look at the simple truth that there's a way that leads to nirvana, to love, to liberation, to freedom, to wholeness. And there's a way that leads to varying degrees of involvement in suffering and conflict and disease. And you just need to see that truth. That's maybe that wisdom isn't as vividly and pervasively understood in the New Age movement. So the versions of Tantra and non-dualism that are understood there tend to be, well, often, not always, but often less than ideal. But nonetheless, from a tantric point of view, I would still honor that the fact that the New Age movement exists, and that there's a sort of honoring of the feminine, an honoring of nature intelligences, an honoring of energy, and a work with things like chakras and kundalini, an openness to psychic perception, and so on and so forth. There's many. All of that, nonetheless, is a sign that a balancing is happening. And so even though that's sort of a popular movement expressing that, and it's not ideal in its form, it's still, to my mind, a positive thing that's happening. It just needs to kind of mature over time. And that's part of what Tantra means, is just sort of heartfully embracing the form that it currently takes and saying, okay, so here's where it's at. And instead of negating it as a way to get to something better, we'll just work with what's there and keep transforming it. It'll keep maturing into a more and more enlightened form of that. Okay, so, well, Lars, I'll check in. Is that yeah? Okay, very good. Well, let's take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back for meditation. All right. Thank you, Johnny, for posting the link to the YouTube version. Thanks for putting that up. I will also email that out as well for those who aren't here today, in case people missed that link. The practice of Tantra mute here, can really take a wide variety of forms. But at its essence, the heart of tantric spiritual practice is an intuition about, it's a kind of a tantric intuition, like a sense of transformation. And transformation comes alive as an intuitive experience. This is really the heart of Tantra. And the form, context in which that's happening can vary. It can happen in the context of all kinds of practices. In fact, practices, some practices could be sort of described as specifically tantric, but many practices are tantric not by virtue of them appearing to be different in their form than some other kind of practice, but because we bring a tantric spirit to that practice. That's what makes it a tantric practice. So both are true. Some practices are more kind of expressive, or can express the tantric spirit more than, say, another. But the inner spirit is really the most important aspect of that. Seems like a good moment to just take a couple minutes to go a little further into that. In understanding the nature of a spiritual practice, we can look at it from different angles. For instance, there's the outer form of the practice. Let's say if one is repeating a mantra or a prayer or chanting or following the breath or engaged in a visualization. This is kind of more the form of the practice. In a sense, practices have a form and a soul and a spirit, just as a human being does. They have that basic threefold nature. And in a sense, the form or personality, you might say, of a practice is any concrete mental or imagined, visualized, or bodily aspect. So for instance, if one is engaged in pranayama and is breathing in a particular way, that's part of the form of that practice. The soul of a practice has more to do with the qualities that we bring. We could do the same practice, let's say repeating a mantra, and we could say it in a alert but detached way, and that's the basic spirit of the repetition of the mantra. Or we could say, let's say if it's the name of a deity, we could be repeating that mantra in a devotional way, and gives a completely different spin to that practice. Same mantra, same form, different soul, different quality of how we approach that practice. And the third level is the spirit in which we do the practice. And one way to look at that is the traditional tantric and non-dual. And that, to some extent, isn't something, to some extent we can cultivate those, but to a large extent, they're kind of more an expression of just what we're experiencing in the moment, how our intuition has developed and the way we simply experience the nature of what's happening in our practice in that moment. So what we'll work with in the meditation that I'm about to do is somewhat familiar, but we're going to kind of emphasize the tantric dimension of it more, and it's more an exploration of that inner essence of it. It's not so much a type of tantric practice as there are many in this type that have complex form or some kind of specific form content. We're going to kind of go into more of the soul and the spirit of tantra in this meditation. Okay, so let's go within. And take a minute to settle in, become more present and centered. Feel your body relaxing, settling. Feel your awareness becoming more present and calm, alert, but relaxed. And focusing for a moment on your body. Feel your body as a whole. Feel your awareness and presence both within your body, spread throughout your body, and also spacious at the same time, not wholly contained within your body. Now, particularly be aware of your presence as a warm energy, a conscious energy that you are and that you can surround your body with. Your body is contained and permeated by this warm presence that you are. Feel this warm presence permeated with a feeling of love and caring for your body. It's a nurturing, healing energy that you've extended throughout and surrounding your body. See if you can feel how it gently awakens the body. Healing, harmonizing, awakening your physical body by the gentle warmth of your presence. If you're particularly aware of discomfort, tension, pain in your body, especially aware to be accepting of that presence, of discomfort, being patient and nurturing the transformation of that energy. Just holding. Emphasizing just letting it be, deeply accepting it. Expand your awareness and presence to include emotions. Specifically, if there are any emotions around at the present, but also just sensing your emotional nature in general, including that in the warmth of your presence. So your body and your feeling and the emotional nature are contained and nurtured by your state of presence. All the qualities of your presence are healing and transforming to your body and emotions. Just by holding them in this way. You may sense feelings in your body or your emotions gently opening up in response to being held this way. If you find yourself feeling heavier or even more tired, then emphasize the spacious aspect of your presence. Expand and lighten up your energy. And when you feel more awake, extend your feelings again to extend the warm energy to your body and feeling. It's like holding your body and the emotions in a warm bath. Bath of loving presence. particularly turn your awareness to your physical body, the sense of how your body's resting on the surface that you're on, aware of the room around you. And when ready, open your eyes. By engaging in a simple practice of this sort, it's possible to intuitively explore the basic sense of the transformational or tantric spirit, seeing if you can, because our state of presence is transformative, is a fire, a light, an energy of transformation. And so, for instance, if we embrace our emotional nature, for instance, or our physical nature in a presence, in an energy field of loving and calm and accepting presence, it fosters a transformation. A transmission happens from our state of presence to our bodies and emotions, and they'll start to shift. Now, first we might notice some of that shift by more kind of concrete signs, like maybe an energy will open up in our bodies, or something will, or we'll even feel something more than we did before. But if we explore a practice like this over time, our kind of sensitivity to what's happening will grow. And we'll actually begin to have a kind of sense of this tantric spirit of how transformation is happening. We'll sense transformation. We'll recognize it. And it's important, though, to approach this in a way that's rooted strongly in patience and love and acceptance, rather than some subtle striving to change or fix our bodies or emotions. That's going to happen through loving and conscious presence, but we don't want to emphasize that too much. We're really kind of emphasizing the deep holding of that energy, and then letting the transformation happen in its own way and in its own time, and just noticing, just developing a sensitivity to that happening. So I'm going to take a moment and unmute for a bit and see if there's anything people want to share from the meditation, or if there's any questions anybody has about that practice.
Yeah.
Yes, Tom, Christian.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful meditation.
Welcome.
This is something that you have been guiding like 20 years back, I suppose, from Denmark, and this has been with me all those years, and I can. It feels like that approach is when you become aware of the body, and like you say, you become aware of the space that the body occupies, and both in the body, around the body, and suffusing the body. And when you have awareness on this, it feels like the subtlety becomes stronger and stronger. So begin to actually transcend the body. But also I feel like there's so much what you have taught about embracing and loving the body, or our whole being, which I find has been tremendously transforming, and to a degree where it feels like my body becomes, in meditation like this, it becomes, it enters another state. So it feels like you're much more free, and the state of being becomes then much more in the forefront. So it's kind of like just it's a very, very natural, very organic approach to begin from the very, like let's say, the traditional or the personality aspect. You mentioned the personality aspect of the practice, and the soul aspect, and the spirit aspect. And it's like moving from the personality aspect by being aware of the physical body, but then as you transcend each level of the body, you just end up with more and more pure awareness, which is really wonderful. So I thank you for this teaching, and I also want to maybe if you can speak more about love. Like we talk a lot about love as what is carrying us through this practice, because as you also say, stuff comes up, energies comes up, maybe emotions comes up, but what is carrying through is really the embracing love, and so there was something else, something more.
It sounded like there was a question that at the end you said, could I speak to love?
Yes.
More.
Yeah.
Actually that kind of brings us into what I feel like is probably the next topic. So how about if I, instead of responding right now to that part of your question, I'll take that into the next phase.
Sure.
How's that sound? Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Good. Well, thank you for sharing. That's wonderful that you feel that way, and and useful and wonderful to hear your experience.
Yeah. So I can only encourage folks to really dig deep into this kind of practice, because we begin to really embrace ourselves. Oh yeah, the thing I forgot was that it feels like, to me at least, that the old style of practice, or the traditional view, also in Christianity, for example, where the traditional views fall short when for example, priests, they have to be renunciates, and then they end up misusing children and so forth. You know, that there are so many things, so many aspects that we also need to heal, that maybe from the past, that we have been going about spiritual practice in a little too harsh fashion, where the renunciate way is quite harsh, can be quite harsh. If you just choose to simply avoid and push away all these aspects of oneself that one doesn't like to see. And this is, again, the tantric approach is really like inviting all that in and saying, I see you, and I invite you to be with me. And the love will carry you through that. And that's where I see it's also tremendously useful.
absolutely. Make a little note here about that. Okay, because I do want to comment on that more, but again, that's sort of a bigger topic. So instead of having a long response, I'll just weave that into the talk as we continue today. So yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. She disappeared there. It was, oops, you muted, so okay, thank you. Any other questions or sharings from the meditation?
I just wanted to say that this meditation is very similar to one that Tsoknyi Rinpoche teaches. It's but he teaches it with the feelings, and interestingly, I wanted to bring him up again earlier too, in reference to your concept of the self. He has these interesting sort of, I'm wondering if you would call tantric perceptions of the self. He has the concept of a mere eye, or like the self. He has all these finer distinctions of the self, of ways in which we discern a self. But he doesn't deny it. He has these just very fine distinctions about the way he defines it. But one of the things that he teaches is something called essence love, and he talks about sitting with your feelings until they dissolve. He says that you might notice. I mean, the instructions are very much like you said, not to push for it, not to strive, not to, just sit with your emotions in a very friendly way. And eventually you might notice that they start to shift, and you might find yourself, sort of in this essence love instead. But my question is about the body and being that way. Like, he doesn't teach that about the body at all. And I'm wondering if you can speak more about what this kind of practice has for potential towards the body, with the body.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting to include the body, because I think in some ways we tend to think often spiritually of the body a little bit different than our psychology, like our emotions, our character, our personality. We think of the latter, the personality, as kind of subject to change. We can refine it, we can transform it, we can illuminate it. And then I think sometimes we tend to think of the body a little bit more like it's just sort of like an organic instrument or vehicle that we have, and it's sort of like there's an inner rider, an inner occupant, and that part is the part that's awakening and transforming and so on. And the body's kind of more or less the same, because it's like a persona that we kind of experience through. But a more subtle and tantric sense of the body would be to understand that it's very much similar to the mind and emotions, in that it's a dynamic organism, and it is capable of transformation and refinement and illumination also. And that we don't want to leave that out. We want to equally embrace the body in that process of transformation. I think, one of the ways that people sometimes can see a sense of this, for instance, is that if they, say, engage in something like a fast, where they temporarily kind of purify and lighten up their diet. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's such a common experience that, it's often the reason that people engage spiritually in fasting and purification diets, is that it opens up and refines. The pranas get more subtle in the body. The body itself gets lighter. The vibrations get lighter. Our perceptions, our intuitions. And we're coming at it from the body side. It's from a change in the body that these shifts are happening in our awareness and in our sensitivities to things. Sometimes from fasting, for instance, people will say, well, my senses got purified. My sense of taste and smell got more acute. got more simple. I could eat a simple food and it would be more enjoyable. My sense of hearing and sight got fresher, cleaner feeling. This is the body refining in its vibration. And there's many ways to do that. Fasting is just one. Spiritual practice in general, if you know, all the bodies interact. So if you refine, say, the emotional body, the physical body will refine in kind. And sometimes it'll even go through sort of crises of shifting, of healing. Karmas will come up that need to sort of get purged. So if you awaken energy on another level, like in your state of presence, in your consciousness, or in one of your subtler bodies, the physical body will go through stuff because it's interdependent with those other bodies, and it has to kind of come up to speed, so to speak. So yes, I think it's very powerful to just include all the levels. You know, sometimes it's easier to focus on a specific level at a given moment, so we might, you know, find it useful to isolate, say, our emotional nature and just be with that aspect of our experience and in practice like that. Or at another time, our physical body. Or subtler still, it's a little bit more difficult for most people, is to be with the mind in a way that's kind of inclusive and spacious, but detached, where we're not drawn into it too much. And that's the key, sort of like the key to how we bring the traditional view or practice into as a foundation to a practice like this, is that it requires that we stay centered. We don't want to become distracted. We don't want to become sort of drawn. Like if you find yourself becoming foggy, heavy, tired when you're working with your feelings or your physical body, it means you're kind of, it's like you want to tread it into the water up to your waist, but not so much that you go underwater. You don't stay up on the shore either, and just you're not in touch with the ocean at all. But you also don't want to submerge. You find a balance, and so the traditional view is part of staying above the water. It's not just getting submerged back into instincts and feelings and emotional reactions, and just become part of. You get centered first. You get present, and then you can, in that state, you can hold other aspects of your nature in a transformative and loving spirit, healing spirit. And then if you find yourself kind of getting pulled into it, then kind of go back to the traditional mode of sort of brightening up and becoming more detached and becoming more present. So there's a little bit of a skill to learn there and a dynamic that's involved. So Tamara, am I speaking to your question?
I think so, yeah. I mean, to the extent that I see my body transforming, I just see it getting older and stiffer and fatter and more painful. So I would like to be able to use a practice like this to sort of mitigate some of that. That's where my my question was coming from, to be honest.
I see. Well, it definitely can have that effect. I think one of the things, though, we have to be aware of in the sort of long-term view of our spiritual development is our practice is going to bring up karma, for instance. So instead of feeling lighter by doing a practice like that, in the next month, let's say we do a practice like that for 15 minutes, we might go through mostly feeling like emotions are coming up and we feel heavier and there's sorrow passing through our bodies. But that's actually a raising of the vibration, because before those emotions were there, but we were tightened around them, which is even more dense. And so at least we're relaxing and opening. And so it feels like we're getting heavier because the stuff's coming out into our awareness. But actually it was there all along. And now it's got a chance to sort of heal and move through and be transformed. So in time, that will lighten up the body, but we sometimes just go through periods where it doesn't feel that way, temporarily. And so, that's something to keep in mind. And also we have our normal human life cycle where we're going to have experience more often than not some loss of vitality, some loss of health as we get older. And we can maintain a strong state of presence regardless of that, and that will help the body to feel less of that. But it's kind of part of the normal life cycle of the physical body. It will tend to kind of move in that direction. But we can, by not only the quality of our presence, but specific practices, yoga, exercise, diet, kind of work to kind of maintain the optimal, situation around our vitality and physical health and so on. So other methods of sort of, it's not a coincidence that in the Hindu tradition, practices like Hatha Yoga are part of the larger general spectrum of tantric practices. Not all tantric practitioners engage in physical practices like that, but it's kind of part of the larger repertoire of practices. And one of the values of that, of course, is kind of keeping the body relaxed and open and overcoming stiffness and just keeping the energy moving better and maintaining our vitality as well as possible. But even so powerful to understand that in a balanced state of presence, where we're aware and we're accepting and we're content and we're kind and loving towards our personality, that the personality will flourish, not only emotionally and mentally, but also physically. The physical body will experience improved health, improved vitality. It will gradually work through the tensions and relax more. But there's a certain history behind that, so it's not an instant thing. We can't expect to sit down and do a practice like that and suddenly in a half an hour or a week of practice, our body's going to feel wonderful. And it's a gradual process, and there's things to work through along the way. But the net effect of the deep integration of our presence, a balanced state of presence with our body, is it's extremely. In fact, this is sort of the far out end of the spectrum, but just to sort of affirm the deepest potential. In traditions like Dzogchen, as the state of presence deepens, and we integrate that with our physical bodies, it actually leads to state. This happens in the Taoist and Hindu traditions and others as well. There's discussion of how this works. That the body can become so transformed that it will become not only very healthy and tend to last longer. Norbu's master, who initiated him into the Dzogchen practices after years of studying other forms of practices in Tibetan Buddhism, Namkhai Norbu found his sort of root guru, Chengshab Dorje. And at that time, he was apparently well over 130 years old and perfectly good health. He looked like he was about 70, but he was in really excellent health, extremely lucid awareness and presence, and excellent vitality, and apparently lived for about another 28 years after Norbu first met him. So by all accounts, well into the 150s. And that's, in this case, not because he was doing special practices to increase his longevity, doing necessarily some kind of special diet or whatever. I'm sure he ate a healthy diet. It was the power of his presence, the depth of his loving embrace and non-dual and tantric embrace of his physical body caused it to be very healthy and live for a long time. And it imbues the immune system too with a great vitality and strength. And eventually it can even be so transformative that the elements that make up the body will be transformed into their corresponding luminosities. And the body itself will, at the end of the incarnation, will simply, instead of dying ordinarily, the body will be fully transformed, like sort of consumed into this state of presence, and just leave the physical world through this kind of profound transformation. So obviously we don't see this happening very often. And if one explores in different cultures like China, and Tibet, and India, for instance, one will hear stories about this. I mentioned earlier Tenzin Palmo, who the British woman who was having a hard time finding a teacher that would teach a woman back in the States. The Tibetan communities softened up a great deal since then, by the way, so that's not quite as prevalent, anywhere near as prevalent, I don't think. But it was, a little bit more when they were first coming out of Tibet. And but she did find teachers, and she engaged in some advanced practices. And one day, one of her teachers, when she was up in the foothills of the Himalayas practicing, one of her teachers came very excitedly and said, come and see, there's some extraordinary phenomena in the valley here. And they went out and they observed that there were clouds of luminosity hovering in the area and rainbows in the sky. And these Dzogchen practitioners knew that when this is the case, it means that some practitioner is probably in the process of taking the rainbow body. That they've achieved such an advanced stage in their practice that they've completely transformed their physical body into luminosity. It's a rare thing, but I've heard of at least a dozen cases in places like China and Tibet and India in the last century or so. And so this teacher came and got Tenzin Palmo and said, come and see. And they thought that was really beautiful, but they didn't really know that anybody was about to do this, so they weren't sure, who must be achieving this ability. And incidentally, this luminosity results from something in the Taoist tradition. One of the energies that they talk about in the human body is sometimes called the worker bee energy. It's the part of your vitality that kind of engages you in life and motivates you to just do ordinary day-to-day things, this sort of basic vitality. And the way they describe it in the Taoist tradition is, as the process of the rainbow body is taking place and the energies are sort of being liberated into their inner luminosities, the physical energies of the body, some of that worker bee energy is not yet ready to enter into this fully into this luminous state. It's getting transformed and it's becoming very radiant, but it doesn't want to quite fully leave the world yet. So it's ejected from the body and it becomes this phenomenon in the environment. Clouds of luminosity, rainbows will appear, and that will mean that will sort of alert other practitioners up. Somebody's taking the rainbow body. So when this master went to Tenzin and said, look, somebody must be taking the rainbow body. These displays of luminosity are happening. So they thought, oh, there's another American here. We should go find them and tell them to come and look too. So they went, knocked on the door. There was no answer. So they went in, and the person's clothes were sitting on their meditation cushion, and there was nobody there. And there was just fingernail and hairs left behind, because that's normally not included in the transformation, because those aren't living tissues. But the rest of the person's body was essentially gone, and so they realized, this must be the person who is the cause of this phenomenon happening. So that's the extreme, end of the spectrum. Not only can the physical body be included in the transformation, and to that degree, but also, of course, we can extend our energy in a way that embraces the world. Our compassionate embrace can engage the world in transformation as well, and help to kind of tantrically raise the energy of the world and consciousness of the world in that same spirit. Okay. Let's see what time it is here. Okay. So as we see, part of this, the way this tantric approach works, is that it's not afraid to embrace life. It's not afraid to work. We work tantrically by laying a foundation in the traditional need to shift our relationship to our bodies, to our personalities, to the world around us, so that we're not just sort of subconsciously caught up in the ordinary flow of life and in a way that isn't as wholesome, isn't as wise. We first kind of disidentify from that flow of phenomena and identity and shift to another center of awareness and being, a more soulful and heartful place. But then from that place, we can embrace that which we've just disidentified with and include it in the process, include it in the transformation and awakening, and become an agent of that awakening for that part. So this is a key part of understanding Tantra. It's a kind of a willingness to enter inside of and with life and phenomena, into an emotion, into our bodies, into life, into relationships, and fully inhabit those realities, so that our presence and our compassion can be a transformative agent. Now, this also can take interesting forms, like it can cause, this understanding sort of leads to an ability or a way of working that sort of opens up new avenues of teaching and healing and transformation. A good example that comes to mind is there's a master who lived in India in the 20th century named Swami Narayan. And he was a very great and renowned tantric master, but didn't have a big worldly presence. He was such a profound person that he was well known kind of in the general spiritual community. In fact, he was widely considered to be the most learned, by many people, the most learned master in the Hindu tradition. He had just encyclopedic knowledge of Hinduism. And yet, he was a very kind of simple, down-to-earth fellow. Used to often just sort of walk around in a pair of simple white pants without a shirt on, and related to people as if he was an ordinary fellow. It's very likely, my feeling is, this is probably the same person that Blavatsky knew as Swami Narayan also. Leadbeater later gave him another name called the Master Jupiter, but his actual name was Swami Narayan. And he was described in similar terms, and a very great master. And Swami Kriyananda, a disciple of Yogananda, went and visited him in the 1950s in India. And one of his students, he was, among other things, a tantric adept, and obviously an Advaitin, because he was a Swami, and those are members of the non-dual, Advaita Vedanta order. One of the stories that Swami Rama shared was that, or Swami Kriyananda, was that some parents went to see Swami Narayan and said, we have a son who is kind of not really, measuring up to our hopes for what he would be like in this life. He gambles, he womanizes, he refuses to work, he's just sort of living off of us, and he's just acting out in these ways. And since you're a great master, could you just go and talk to him and talk some sense into him, and get him to live a more wholesome and wise life? And so, what they expected probably was that this master would go and kind of wave his finger at him and tell him like the right way to live, the traditional, like, right and wrong, this is how you should be living. But Swami Narayan didn't do that. He simply went and didn't reveal what he was there for. He just befriended the fellow. And not only that, he adopted some of the same behavior. He started drinking with him. He would womanize with them. They would sit around and have conversations about different prostitutes, like, oh, isn't she wonderful? And have you tried this one? So he just tantrically embraced the reality that this person was living in and became his friend. And then when his friend was kind of completely won over to that, this is his buddy, and they're just, living life the same way, then Swaminarayan started, making comments like, this is getting kind of boring. I don't feel like this is, and then his friend, this, his now friend, this person that the parents asked him to help, he'd go, yeah, this is kind of boring. And slowly he would just kind of show him the way out by being it, by taking on the reality that he was living, and then just kind of growing out of it, and in his love and wisdom, embracing this fellow and just guiding him out. The whole way, the guy had no idea that, what was going on, because he felt so loved and embraced and accepted for who he was, that it just fostered an organic awakening in him, where he kind of got it on his own. Like, obviously, Swaminarayan was powerfully transmitting a transformative and illuminating energy, but it kind of did it from within, rather than, a sort of authority saying, this is how you should live. And the person's life completely changed, and he stopped gambling, he stopped womanizing, got a job, and felt, more satisfied with his life after that. And that's not all tantric teaching needs to take a form like that, but that's, that would be a good example of a type of tantric spirit where you're that willing to enter into relativity to life and to participate in the awakening in that deeply embodied and compassionate way. Another fun story that comes to mind that's kind of like on the same line is that there's a very well-known American Zen Buddhist teacher named Philip Kapleau, Roshi Philip Kapleau, who became interested in Zen in the 1940s because he was a war correspondent, and he went and covered the trials, like the Nuremberg trials and the Japanese war crimes trials as well, right after World War II ended. And the atrocities were so horrific that he was listening to, that it kind of really shook him up and started him on a spiritual quest of questioning, why is all this suffering? And it was pretty hard to just kind of go back to ignoring the reality that this kind of depth of suffering and atrocity exists in life. So, having been in Japan to cover the trials, he got interested in Zen. So after he came back to the United States and finished the work he was covering, he decided to go back to Japan, and he spent 13 years in a Zen monastery studying Zen, and became a Zen Roshi and teacher, and came back to the United States. And one of the stories that he shares is that when he was in Japan, one of his teachers took him to a brothel, and he ended up, and they were drinking sake and hanging out with the prostitutes, and he was very confused because his understanding was very traditional about spirituality, right and wrong, wholesome and unwholesome, the renunciate. And here's his Roshi hanging out with prostitutes and just kind of being very loving to them. And then one of the prostitutes kind of grabbed a hold of Kapleau and got him into her room and wanted to, be a prostitute with him and, earn her living and fulfill this function. And he was very rigid and, overwhelmed by the situation and kind of freaked out. And the Roshi came and watched him kind of burst out of the room, was kind of running for his life to get out of there. And the Roshi was just laughing, uproariously, tears rolling down his face. He thought the whole thing was hilarious. So when they left, he asked the Roshi, what was that all about? Why did you bring me there? And he said, it was a teaching. The reality is in Zen is that you enter fully into each situation. So to really have been compassionate in that situation, you should have had sex with that woman, because that's what she needed. She needed to make a living. You were there, so she thought you were there for that reason. So she wanted to have sex with you. Now she feels rejected. She feels like something must be wrong with her, that you wouldn't do it. The compassionate thing to have done was just have sex with her. And that you wouldn't do that meant that you didn't get Zen. You didn't get the spirit of just being fully in the present to be compassionately willing to do what was necessary to fulfill each situation. So, he realized that was just a learning experience, that the reason why the Roshi brought him there. Because even though outwardly the Roshi looked like he was drinking sake, he was liberated from that. He wasn't caught up in it. And yet he was fully willing to just be compassionate in that situation according to what that would look like. So this is more in that tantric spirit too, of just being willing to be flexible in each situation. Of course, we're not always in these situations where we need to sort of bend the rules and embrace behaviors that look unwholesome from the outside. But sometimes even tantric masters are willing to do that. And there's very sort of more esoteric ways of understanding, ways that initiates do sometimes even create whole emanations, whole incarnations that actually have that spirit of compassionately embracing a personality and a lifestyle that doesn't necessarily look like what you'd expect it to look like, but it's serving a kind of transformative and illuminating function in the world in some particular way. So very often people who are seeking to understand these realities, seeking to understand what the work of masters looks like, for instance, they imagine it in more traditional ways. And so when a master appears in a very traditional style, then they recognize it. They don't necessarily recognize it sometimes when it appears in a more tantric style, because it may still look fairly traditional, or it may not, may look like something else that they didn't expect. So in that sense, there are very interesting avenues of more esoteric understanding that become more open intuitively to us as we understand the spirit of Tantra more. So I'm gonna shift again to unmuting and just see if there's, as we're coming towards the end, just see if there's any questions, comments. Okay, if there are, you can, alert me somehow. I'll keep talking. You could put it in the chat box or somehow indicate otherwise. So what is the essence of what causes the transformation? What is this transformative fire? What is its nature? And why, how is it different such that it leads to transformation rather than, let's say, a purification where something is kind of like released or neutralized and ceases to affect us like an emotion or a desire, but it isn't still around in some transformed form? Well, one of the key ways to understand that is that when an energy that's part of our nature, say an emotion or desire, comes up in our experience, how we relate to it is part of what determines whether it's simply re-energized and keeps going, or it's essentially kind of calmed down, like de-energized, so it loses its vitality and stops influencing us, or it is transformed. One of the key, in the context of, say, a desire, an energy pattern in our nature, like an emotion or desire that has a strong desire component in it, is if we experience the energy arising in a state of presence that's loving, then that love starts to replace the personality-centered desire that thought form, that emotion, that energy was based on in the first place. So for instance, let's say if sorrow is arising in our experience and we feel that sorrow with love and compassion, then the personal component of it will gradually get transformed, and it will be replaced with love, and that will transform this experience of sorrow into a capacity to be empathetic and to understand sorrow compassionately. And ultimately, even the sorrow itself will get refined into compassion. And it's the love in our nature that's transforming it. It's replacing the personal desire with a transpersonal love. And that transforms that energy from being personal sorrow into being a form of compassion. So everything that's arising because of, and so that's, at that moment, I'm kind of emphasizing the love aspect of it, but equally connected to that is wisdom. We can look at it from the wisdom angle too. Every energy that's created in our nature, every emotion, every desire, every thought, is born out of a particular point of view. So if we re-experience that energy, that thought, that emotion from a more enlightened point of view, then that more enlightened point of view gets sort of infused into that energy and transforms it. It literally is imbued with a deeper understanding, which enlightens it. So in a sense, you could say there's a knowingness component to every energy in our nature, whether it's an emotion or a thought or a desire or a memory. And there's a feeling component. Sometimes the mental component, the knowingness component is stronger, so we call it a thought. Sometimes the feeling component is stronger, and we call it a desire or emotion. But both have both, and ultimately it's both the quality of our wisdom and the quality of our love that is the transforming agent that brings about the transformation of all the energies that make up our personalities. Are made up of the big, rich field of previously created thoughts and attitudes and philosophical ideas and memories and perceptions and interpretations and emotional reactions and desires. There's often a way that we tend to think of these things as they sort of come and go in our system. But actually, every time one of them is formed, it's now a thing in itself, a desire. If I energize a desire, let's say I want to exercise every day, I'm gonna do aerobics or something. I just created an elemental when I energize that desire, a thought form, a thing. I'm trying to kind of use some terminology that kind of really encapsulates or draws our attention to the idea that this is an energy pattern that exists in and of itself, and then it has persistence and it stays around. And since we're generating thoughts and desires and perceptions and reactions and interpretations to our lives all the time, our subconscious is filled with this material. And in order for us to transform our personality, this material needs to be transformed. It needs to be elevated. It needs to be at least purified in the sense that we kind of have to kind of quiet it down. We can, if we remove the vitality, the desire that's impelling these energies to continue to influence us, then at least they'll calm down. So we have the choice to either, in our spiritual path, either purify them, neutralize them, or to transform them and include them in our ongoing expression. And so this is a good part of the work. There's really two main areas of our spiritual development. There is our fundamental awakening, the development of wisdom in our essential state of consciousness. What level of wisdom have we cultivated? And then the other aspect is at what level of energy and maturity are all of these energy patterns that make up our personality, our thoughts and desires and emotions and so on. Because they will influence how well that wisdom presence can express in our human personality in our lives, because it has to kind of shine through a personality that's filled with all these past creations, which will filter and condition how it comes out. So an important part of our liberation and awakening is transforming and purifying our personalities. So the tantric views hold both of those meanings, but it particularly pertains to the transformation of our personalities. It's a key vision of how to work with our personalities, as well as the world around us as servers. A vision of how to work with that transformation of the energy patterns of our bodies, our personalities, and of nature, the world around us, even the civilization that we're part of, the culture we're part of. All of it can be transformed. Many people are familiar with the distinction in the Hindu tradition. There's a triple deity: Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahman, or Brahma, not Brahman. Brahman is the universal, non-dual, transcendent reality. So that's with an N at the end. And Brahma is a kind of deity and principle of the creative agency within relativity. So when we witness, say for instance, if we're witnessing a birth, a child is being born, that Brahma is the deity that sort of presides over birth, its creation, its emergence. Whereas Shiva, in this context, is the destroyer, the deity of death, the deity of the culmination or the end of a cycle, the passing away of something. So the deity, if you will, that would preside over death would be Shiva. Now, this is not the same use of the word Shiva as in the Shiva-Shakti polarity. So that's something else. That's a little bit of a different spin on Shiva as a deity. They're related, but not identical. And then the middle deity of that trimurti, that trinity of deities, is Vishnu. And Vishnu is the preserver, the maintainer. So that energy, for instance, that maintains our bodies through our lives. It's not the energy that birthed us or created our bodies, nor is it the energy that culminates in incarnation and leads to us passing away. It's the energy that sustains our life. And in that sense, in a certain way, Tantra is a Vishnu type spirituality. It preserves the form, but evolves it, it transforms it. So in one sense, something is passing away. The old version is passing away. And Brahma is there as kind of creating a new version, and yet there's a continuity to the essence of the form. The form, let's say, for instance, as we're growing as human beings, from the physical point of view, there's some transformation going on. We grow up, we change, we evolve, and yet we're still inhabiting this form. It transforms, our body goes through changes, how we express ourselves through this body goes through changes. Still the same, in a certain sense, it's the same body, but in another sense, it's evolving. So that's kind of what the preserver means, is it's a continuity, a maintenance of a form or an appearance or an expression, while at the same time it's growing, evolving. So ultimately, the tantric principle embraces all three principles, but it's very centered more in that middle path. Whereas, by contrast, the neti style, like a sort of, let's say, for instance, a path that emphasizes a renunciate style and also a kind of style of letting go, of saying, the world is Maya and it's all an illusion. I'm going to shatter that illusion with my sword of wisdom and just be liberated into the equanimous, pure witness that doesn't get caught up in the drama of all of that. And so I let go of all of that. I renounce the thoughts and the identities and the body and my lifestyle. Like in the Swami order, for instance, you go through a ceremony where you renounce your genetic heritage. You say, I'm being reborn. I'm not this. I don't have that name anymore. That's not my family. I'm dying to all of that, and I'm now, Swami so and so, and my new family is the Sangha. There's a Shiva quality to that, the destroyer, a letting go of, that's emphasized more. So you could say, if that's emphasized, if that principle is kind of the dominant principle, that's a sort of a Shiva style of being on the path. And certainly there are Brahma or creator styles, or emphasizing expression, positivity, affirmation, creativity, manifestation. These are all part of so even something as simple as doing metta, the practice in Buddhism of repeating blessings. That's sort of a Brahma thing. It's an affirmative, positive, serviceful thing to do. Tantra is sort of kind of in the middle. It embraces all three, but it emphasizes the transformation of life and the inhabiting of life and the embracing of life in the transformative spirit, rather than overdoing, or strong leaning one way or the other towards these two other principles. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and wind up now? But before I do, I'll see if there's any final question or two.
I have a clarifying question.
Yes.
Do I understand it correctly that the tantric view is in order to practice it properly as it's supposed to be, as you describe it now, you need to actually be in touch with the quality of love and compassion. If not, you will not be able to practice tantra, tantric practices. I'm asking this because once I did a guided meditation, and we guided that something with using love. Then one of the those who were participating in it said to me afterwards that she didn't feel that she was in contact with this love, so she didn't know how to do the exercise. And this points me in this direction, that asking you this about this.
I would say to some extent that's true. It's not so black and white, because you can foster transformation in other ways. We've talked about the exercise, for instance, we did today kind of emphasized what you just described, a kind of love-based. But there's other ways. Remember last week, for instance, where we did the visualization and the energies moving out. You don't necessarily have to be able to access like a strong sense of sitting in a state of loving presence to do that, and it's still a tantric practice. So there's definitely a lot of tantric practices that still are essentially based in that spirit, but they're not as much requiring being able to bring forth a feeling of love. So yeah, I wouldn't restrict it to that, but ultimately the deepest stages of Tantra are certainly based in a strong presence of love and compassion as part of that, yeah. But it's not required that be that accessible say, for instance, in the case of that woman, there's other forms of Tantra that she could probably do, but maybe not, some of the other things that we've talked about. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
Another clarification question.
Yes.
You were talking about the two things you need to do towards the end there. One was, it sounded to me like you were sort of speaking about like what is traditionally the Buddhist two accumulations of wisdom and merit. But I just wanted to double check because you were talking about a sort of a purification of the personality and thought forms and so forth and so on. Is that your interpretation of how merit is developed, or am I just off in the wrong direction?
No, you're right. That's exactly it. Yeah, when you think about what it means to accumulate merit, it's really kind of more of a karmic idea of developing positive qualities or positive karmic manifestations. So, for instance, traditionally accumulating merit might be recitation of a mantra as one of the practices in Tibetan Buddhism. That's a sort of a mental form, a mantra that you're saying internally or externally, and it accumulates, in a sense, positive karma. Whereas if you do prostrations, that's more, the emphasis and the form of that is the body doing the prostration, again accumulating. So in a sense, the whole personality is, one way to look at it is it's an accumulation of karma. It's accumulation of the vibrations that result from different ways of thinking and feeling and reacting and desires and behavior. And not just physical behavior, but internal actions as well. Like if you say metta, that is accumulating positive subtle merit because you're generating energies in the inner subtle world, but you're saying them verbally. And so it exists as a karmic action, a merit in the subtle body and in the subtle dimensions. So if you look more at wisdom in its deepest essence, it's formless, it's intuitive, it's beyond the specific forms that it could express through. It's not, this particular thought, this particular action. It's something spacious and formless. And so that's why in Tibetan Buddhism, they distinguish between the form level of thoughts and actions on a subtle and physical level, and that on that level you accumulate merit because our nature is the sum total of our actions on those levels. And then another aspect of our nature is formless, and the pure qualities of compassion and wisdom is what's sort of accumulated, if you will, on that level. So yeah, if you want to put it that way, that's sort of my interpretation. I do think it's very consistent with their interpretation. There's still a little different terminology. Like they would say mind, voice, and body as where you would accumulate merit. You can accumulate mental merit and voice merit and body merit, but it's essentially the same idea of talking about the form level versus the wisdom level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, I think your way of articulating it makes a whole lot more sense than the traditional way. I never really understood the whole concept of merit.
I see. Well, good. Yeah, I don't mind the way they say it, but I say it the way I do because I feel like it's maybe a little more understandable that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week.